Hello, buenos dias. I'm Rachel Stoll, Vice President at the Stimson Center, a nonprofit policy think tank located in Washington, D.C., where I also direct the Conventional Defense Program. I'm very pleased today to serve as the webinar moderator for this event. So welcome to the CUGH 2021 satellite session, Gun Violence in Mexico and Central America, the Challenges and Paths to Solution. So pleased you have joined us. And I want to let you know you may listen in English or en Espanol by selecting your language at the bottom of the Zoom page. You can see the translation button at the bottom. This webinar, this session is sponsored by the Network for the Prevention of Gun Violence in the Americas. The network was formed in 2020 to bring together health professionals, human rights advocates, arms trade specialists, and violence prevention activists to focus on the challenges ahead and find solutions to address gun violence in Mexico and Central America. To find out more information about the network, you can use the link in the chat that will be posted momentarily. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. Please use the Q&A function, which is located in the lower part of your screen, to post comments or questions. We do want to hear from you and have this session be interactive. There's also a chat function that is located in the lower part of your screen that you can use to post your comments. And I see that many people have already begun to post comments and let us know who is here, which is wonderful. Please feel free, as some of your colleagues are doing, to introduce yourself. You may offer comments or perspectives or ideas for our panelists to discuss throughout the duration of the webinar. I think it's really appropriate that on this International Women's Day, we are convening a session to talk about gun violence. Gun violence is a global health problem of epidemic proportions, especially in the Americas, and it often disproportionately impacts women and their communities. Firearms and other weapons contribute to countless deaths, devastating harm, and humanitarian crises around the world, and particularly in this region of the world. For years, the region has had the highest rates of lethal and non-lethal gun violence in the world. Our best estimates are that there are approximately 1 billion small arms in circulation around the world today. Analysts have noted that these weapons are produced by more than 1,000 companies in nearly 100 countries. More than 850 million, or 85% of firearms around the world, are believed to be in civilian hands. Guns are the vectors of this epidemic, and bullets, when released, are the pathogens hidden in plain sight. According to a recent JAMA study, of the 250,000 global gun deaths each year, 6 countries account for more than half: the US, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and Guatemala. The epidemic concentrates within the region's cities. In 2018, 47 of the 50 most violent cities in the world were in the Americas, with gun violence regularly constituting between 60 and 80% of homicides. This epidemic of death and injury disproportionately affects youth and children, with significant economic, developmental, health, and social impacts. Stronger policies in the US, Mexico, and Central America to reduce illegal gun transfers to organized crime are needed. This satellite session will discuss gun violence in the Americas, framing this burden as a public health issue, and it is meant to convene public health, healthcare systems, academicians, humanitarian, arms control, policy, and other leaders of civil society to focus on the challenges and paths towards solutions. The focus of this session will be on Mexico and Central America and the flow of the flow of guns from US and other sources. The speakers will elaborate on the scope of the problem and identify areas of prevention, utilizing classic public health strategies, strengthening data sources, addressing the movement of the vector, following the gun's licit and illicit flows to affected countries, and identifying policy strategies to reduce the illicit flow of guns. We have a diverse and expert group of professionals who are tirelessly addressing this issue, and we're pleased that you have joined us to hear their perspectives and efforts. We've split the afternoon into two panels. We will have a Q&A session at the end, although I'm hoping to also have some time for questions during the panels themselves. So with that brief introduction and welcome, I'd like to start our first panel. And for those who have joined since I began my remarks, please select either English or Spanish from the menu at the bottom so that you may hear the presentation in the language you are most comfortable. You'll see our agenda here. We'll start with our first panel, which examines the public health burden of gun violence in Mexico and Central America and its broader impact on communities and civil society. You all should have the longer bios of each presenter, so I will just provide an abbreviated introduction, but you will see what talented experts that we have with us today. So we'll begin first with Arturo Cervantes, who is a medical doctor with master's and doctorate degrees from Harvard University in public health. Since 2000, he has been the professor and chair of public health at the Faculty of Health Sciences of Anáhuac University in Mexico. Dr. Cervantes will provide the background and current status on the silent public health epidemic that is sweeping Mexico and reflections on the agents and vectors of a complex humanitarian emergency. Welcome, Dr. Cervantes.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of this satellite session of the Consortia of Universities for Global Health. Over 3 years ago, we began this dialogue within the consortia to great recognition and urgency, and I'm very glad to be sharing with Stefania, Robert, Lucia, and Stephen a couple of minutes. So let me see if I can get this. Okay. So I will share some reflections on gun violence in Mexico. And I would like to start by recognizing that Mexico as a country represented in this drawing by this person is tremendously wounded. And it's been wounded for decades. For the last 2 to 3 decades, things have been getting worse and worse. And I will just share some reflections about this tragic and mostly silent epidemic where every day 100 persons die in Mexico from homicides and more than 1,000 are seriously injured according to official estimates, but many much more are really seriously injured, including mental health injuries. A country where every day 3,000 people are hospitalized because of injuries and violence-related injuries. And of these, more than 200 every day will remain for their lives with a permanent disability. And other speakers that will follow me will share with you incredible data and visuals and analytics. And I just want to recognize that we've been watching this trend growing over the first 2 decades of this millennia. Even when we looked at it from 2010 as a cutoff point, the yellow lines, it was sharply increasing in the first decade. But when you cut off to 2017, the rise in the rate of homicides among Mexicans is staggering. And it's continued to grow over this period. We had close to 500,000 dead people because of homicides, and 150,000 are expected to die in the coming years if we don't do anything. And you will hear in this satellite session about the agent and the vector of this disease. Unfortunately, it is a man-made vector that is being promoted by special interest groups, and that its trafficking has been going on for decades. From a public health perspective, we began to observe these trends in Mexico in the early in the early first decade of the century. As you can see here in 2015, the first column, the 7th cause of death in 2015 was homicide. The 10th was motor vehicle accidents. And by 2016, it had gone up to the 6th place, the homicide. And you can also see in the different columns the age groups of how homicide continues to be the first cause of death for young people and even children 5 to 14 years of age. You go to 2017 and it became the 4th cause of death. You go to 2018 and it became the 3rd cause of death generally throughout the country, with staggering rates that you will hear about it. I reflect on the first weeks that we were in Ciudad Juarez, and we read such headlines in the newspapers. The story of Pee-wee, an 18-year-old on the left-hand side, who was a sicario, and for less than $100 a month, he had over 62 assassinations in his history. Or the story of Jorge David on the right-hand side, author of 37 homicides, also a hired gun, age 20. What kind of communities are we creating? I have been asking this question for over a decade now. And just last year was the worst year in terms of homicides in Mexico since the revolution. Homicides and feminicides continue to go up, with the last year being the highest on record. There's a massacre reported every 5 days in Mexico. Just last year, 71 massacres occurred throughout the country. What we were observing in Ciudad Juarez in 2007, 2008, spread like an infectious and contagious disease. 2020 has seen the highest numbers of assassinated women in Mexican history. Every day, there is more and more assassinations of children and gender killings and feminicides in the country. 10 women are killed every day. And this is getting worse. And it's getting worse in part because of impunity. 9 out of 10 of these homicides remain without punishment or without coming to terms with the law. It is known that the justice system is failing, given many obstacles in the investigations. And we've known for a while that the judicial system of the country is overwhelmed by the amount of crime on the one hand side. And on the other side, you will hear today how the flow of guns has been accumulated to an unprecedented level of trafficking in recent years, and how this is the agent and the vector that is feeding this epidemic. The gun smuggling operations that are feeding the cartels are well known to the industry and to the thousands of shops that you will hear about today that are selling these products, agents and vectors of disease. In Mexico, over 70% of guns recovered in crime scenes come from the United States. The rest from a few European countries. And the situation, as you can see, is much worse in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, where most of the weapons used to destroy society and to kill people are coming from US manufacturers. A recent study that we have done indicates this grave pandemic in this pyramid. For each homicide, of course, there is a funeral, but there's 2 rapes and at least 2 people that will result with a permanent disability, 5 extortions, vehicle robbery, 30 emergency room visits, hospitalizations. Homicides are just on the top of the iceberg. We have calculated that weapons used not only in homicides, but for extortions, for armed robbery, for kidnappings, for property crimes, for all sorts of social misconduct throughout the country happens with guns. And we have estimated the cost and the figures that this is having on our society. Just in the latest year of this analysis, 2019, 76 billion US dollars a year are lost because of the consequences of gun violence and crime and homicides in Mexico. And this scenario only seems, unfortunately, to be getting worse and worse. We could save a lot of money if we put science and evidence and attack the enormous amount of the GDP that our country is losing because of violence in general and because of gun violence in particular. So I'm very happy to be here because some years ago we decided that we could not be quiet on this topic and that there is a truth that the flow of guns from north to south is harming development. So it's a pleasure to be part of this effort to stop US arms flow to Mexico and Central America and to treat this as what it is, a public nuisance that is harming our countries south of the United States border, and that is a willful neglect of this industry and its policies of our neighbors. The inept armed policies are costing a lot of human damage, and we are able to ascertain that it's a complex humanitarian disease and it's a contagious and infectious, and the agents and vectors are the guns and the weapons, both legal and illegal, coming into Mexico. So thank you very much. And I end with this thought of Albert Einstein. The right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal part of what one has found to be true. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arturo, for that wonderful introduction to the conversation we will be having today. Next, I'd like to turn to Estefania Vela, who is Executive Director of Intersecta, a feminist research and advocacy organization which is committed to ending gender discrimination in Mexico through the promotion of intersectional and evidence-based policies. Estefania's presentation is focused on the impact of firearms on the homicides of men and women in Mexico. Welcome, and I turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for this space and for this very necessary conversation. For us at the Intersecta, it is always an opportunity to learn from those that are delving into the details of this complex problem. I echo Rachel's sentiment that it is very important to have this conversation on the 8th of March, which is the International Day of Women, because gun violence is a feminist issue. And in the case of Mexico, gun violence has become one of the #1 threats to the safety, security, and lives of women. Given time restriction, as Rachel said, I'm going to focus for now specifically on the impact of firearms on men and women's homicides in Mexico, trying to highlight both the differences in impacts and the similarities, which we think is important to understand what is happening with women in Mexico. Next slide, please. As it happens in many other countries, firearms impact both men and women, and you can see this clearly in homicides. However, there are some important gender differences that need to be taken into account. On the left, I'm showing I just saw that. On the left, I'm showing the totality of homicides of men and women for the period of 1998 to 2019. And you can see how men and women were murdered. And on the case of men, you can see that the pink, which is homicides by firearm, is slightly bigger than in the case of women. And what we have is that out of the total murders of men, 65% were committed with firearms, and in the case of women, they represent 45%. Now, I'm mentioning this because in the case of Mexico, the feminist movement has been much more focused on other forms of homicides of women that impact women disproportionately. This is the case, for example, of asphyxia, which in the graph is green, and you can see that in the case of women, it's much bigger. And this is also the case of blunt and cutting objects. And the entire history of the concept of femicide in the country shows how a lot of the focus has been precisely on these differences. In this scenario, the impact of firearms in a lot of ways remains, is lessened, to say the least. No? On the right hand, though, there's another interesting gender difference between the impact of firearms. If you take the total number of homicides by firearms and look at where they happened, you can see that in the case of women, homicides by firearm committed in the home almost double the homicides with firearms committed in the home for men. In women, they represent almost 1 in every 4, and in men, it's basically 1 in every 10. Oh, so these are like the basic gender, the basic gender differences in firearm homicides, and they are of course important. There's a lot of discussion, for example, about guns as a public security issue, and in the country, a lot of times public security tends to leave out what happens in the home. And what this reminds us is that, at least for women, it is not enough to implement policies that look into violence that happens outside the home, but we also need policies that look into what happens in the home. Next slide, please. Now, what I don't want to, what I need to also mention, however, is that although these differences persist, there has been a radical change in the way women are killed in the country. And in this change, firearms are incredibly important. These are some of the studies on which my presentation is based. Most of them, with one exception, are not available in English, but for those that speak Spanish, I invite you to look them over. They have been documenting in different ways the impact of firearms, particularly on women in the recent context. Next slide, please. Now, what is the recent context? And I'm sure you've heard about this. Basically, if we want to understand homicides and firearms today, including their impact on women, we need to take into account the change in the drug war strategy that happened under President Felipe Calderon. Now, as you know, Mexico drug regulations are old. Drugs remain a federal crime and have been so for decades. But what changed in 2007 specifically is that the military was deployed like never before, in numbers never before seen, with a budget never before seen, to directly combat organized crime. And what you can see in these graphs is how both the homicide rates of men and the homicide rates of women began increasing. And you can also see how, although we know men are the majority of the victims of homicides, the tendencies are very similar. In both cases, homicides had been decreasing for decades. And in both cases, we see a sharp increase beginning 2007. We see a first spike in 2011, short decrease after that, and then a new spike from 2015. Now, next slide, please. Once we analyze what actually increased, what we can see is that most of the increases are due to firearms. This is out of the total murders of what men and women respectively, what percentage was committed with firearms? And we can see that the percentage for both men and women increases. In the years where we see a spike in the overall murder rate, we see a spike in the murder committed by firearms. Now, what I want to show, however, is that this increase has been disproportional for the case of women. For example, in men, in 2000, murders by firearm represented 54% of all murders. And by 2019, they were 73%. In women, they went from being 30% to 57%. So now it's almost 6 out of 10. But the change, it's more dramatic in the case of women. Next slide, please. We can also see this in the case when we analyze not percentage, but murder rates. I'm comparing in here the two most other common forms of murder, which is asphyxia and blunt and cutting objects. And we can see how both for men and for women, there was an increase. So we see there's an overall increase in murders, but the ones that dramatically increase the most are murders by firearm. And we can also see similar increases. And again, if we compare rates, the increase is much more dramatic for women than it is for men. Next slide, please. Now, I want to mention, and I know my time is almost up, but one final change that we think is important. No? And here is out of the total number of homicides committed with firearms, where did they occur? Now, the left line is in public, and the blue line is in the home. Now, you can see that in the case of men, there's always been a huge gap, and that hasn't really changed a lot with time. No, for men, most homicides with firearms are committed in public. This has been the case and continues to be the case. But for women, you can see how previous to 2006, they were sort of at the same risk in both spaces. But starting 2006, we see the gap widen, and homicides by firearms in public outnumber those committed in the home. This doesn't mean, and I think this is important to say, that we have solved the problem of homicides by firearm in the home. That problem remains. But the explosion we have seen has been especially in the public. So in a lot of ways now, women have double the risk. We have the same old problem of violence in the home, and now going out into the street is even much more dangerous. Now, I know there's going to be a second round of this, but I also want to stress that the importance of looking into the militarization of public security has to do with two things. In the case of Mexico, if we want to go to gun control supposedly falls within the scope of the military. But what we see is an increasing power of the military, an increasing production and gun importation by the military, and an increase in the direct violence perpetrated by the military with firearms. So the challenge in the country is not minor, because it's not just about making visible the impact firearms have in violence, but also making visible how those charged with changing this have directly contributed to the problem that we have. No? That is it for me right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Estefania. I think, as you said at the outset, it is quite an appropriate day to be reflecting on the gendered impacts of gun trafficking. And it's important to recognize those differences, not only today, but every day as we think about policy solutions. So thank you for that very visual reminder of the differences. Next, I'm honored to turn to Robert Mugga, who is a globally recognized specialist in public security, cybersecurity, and smarter cities. He is co-founder and principal of the SecDev Group, which is a digital risk firm focused on using data-driven analytics to solve complex challenges with clients, ranging from tech companies to public utilities. He is also co-founder of the Aguirre Institute, which is ranked the top social policy think tank in the world by Prospect in 2019, and is committed to data-driven security, justice, digital rights, and climate action. Robert will do three things in his presentation. First, he will provide an overview of the scope and scale of gun-related violence in Mexico and Central America. Second, a discussion of the characteristics of gun violence across the region, especially its spatial, temporal, and demographic features. And finally, he'll add a quick word about costs, with the idea of explaining how rather than what the costs are. So Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you and welcome you to our conversation today.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks to this consortium and my fellow panelists for this really extraordinarily important review of a very challenging topic on a very, and most significantly symbolic day. As all of our panelists have mentioned, and as everyone on this call knows, these are amongst the worst affected countries and regions in the world when it comes to the health burden of gun violence. I think it's important to situate Mexico and the Northern Triangle in a very tough neighborhood of Latin America and the Caribbean, which has 10 of the 15 most violent countries on the planet. And as Rachel said, 47 of the 50 most violent cities in the world, and that oscillates. It's also Latin America and the Caribbean home to a third of the world's homicides, and yet it has just 1/10 of its population. Next slide, please. Rachel's already gone through a little bit what I'm going to discuss, so I won't say much more about that, simply to say that I'll cover these 3 quick topics. I'm not going to talk today so much about prevention and reduction in the presentation. That may come out in the question and answering period. I think it's important to get a handle on these 3 questions that are raised here, because it's key to have good data to inform smarter interventions when it comes to gun policy. Next slide, please. Before I review the scope and scale, I think let's just have a quick word about conceptual categories, because we're using concepts like lethal and non-lethal gun violence throughout this conversation. And I think, as everyone here knows, these categories themselves could be and should be disaggregated. Lethal violence, when we talk about lethal violence associated with guns, we're talking about intentional homicide, and I'll focus a lot on that. But we also talk about unintentional homicide or manslaughter. We talk about femicide, which Stefania has spoken about. We talk about self-directed violence or suicide, and we talk about police killings. These different categories tend to be reported differently. And so a lot of the statistics that we use when we compare countries may or may not include various categories together. So it's important, I think, that we're a little bit parsimonious. When it comes to non-lethal violence, there's also, of course, a wide range of categories involving the use of firearms, ranging from assault and theft and robbery and property crime, but also issues like disability, pain and suffering, and displacement. And I'm sure my fellow panelists will talk a bit about this. There's often a conflation, though, as I mentioned, of many of these categories, and that can contribute to some pretty uneven reporting when it comes to looking across countries or even within countries, as well as leading to some gaps in our knowledge. Next slide, please. It's also useful, I think, to distinguish between different categories or contexts in which gun violence takes place. We often discriminate in public health between self-directed, interpersonal, and collective violence. But here again, I think it's important to break things down a little bit. As you'll see on the right-hand side, collective violence, which typically involves 3 or more people, can take place in a variety of different contexts involving narco or cartel-based violence, organized gangs and street gangs, militia and paramilitaries, even vigilante types of violence. But also included in that category are political forms of violence, including assassinations of journalists, of human rights activists, and environmental defenders. The other category we typically have is interpersonal violence, again, which can be broken down into basic forms of criminal victimization, as well as intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And with respect to self-directed violence, we typically, as I mentioned, are referring to suicide, but also other forms of self-inflicted injuries. The point is that there's a wide category of contexts in which gun violence is occurring. And it's really important and mindful that we're aware of these different contexts because they lead to very different policy conclusions. Next slide, please. One of the factors that overwhelmingly stands out, and this is the point of this entire seminar, is the disproportionately high use of firearms in lethal and non-lethal violence. As was already mentioned, over 70% on average of homicides in the region, in Mexico and Central America, are committed with firearms. And the global average is about 35%. So I think it's important to look at, we're talking about double the global average. This scatter plot here reveals the rates of gun violence over time in selection of countries, including Mexico and Northern Triangle countries, across different years. And you see that the proportion of guns used in homicide sometimes rises above 90%. So guns clearly play a determinant factor in lethal outcomes. And there's also an especially high rate of gun use against women in the context of femicide and intimate partner violence, as Stefania already mentioned. The point here, though, is also to mention that there's a stunning degree of impunity with respect to gun violence and other forms of, including from homicide to other forms of crime. The clearance rate, so the rate of prosecution, is extraordinarily low across the Americas, including on the countries we're focusing on today. We're talking about between 90 and 95% of homicides not resulting in a conviction. In other words, murder is cheap in many parts of the region. Next slide, please. So the first and most obvious point is that all the countries in the region suffer from a tremendous burden of gun violence, irrespective. And this can be measured in terms of lost lives, as we see here in terms of homicide. But as was mentioned in that really clever, I thought, triangle presented by Arturo, we also are talking about physical injuries, mental trauma and illness, disabilities, pain and suffering. The red line here illustrates the national prevalence for homicide in 2020. And you see that there's some variation across countries. Honduras, Mexico, and Belize sort of seem at the top. El Salvador, Guatemala, and Panama more in the middle. And then finally, we have Nicaragua and Costa Rica. But all of these levels are extremely high, sometimes 2 to 3 times higher than the global average. But this conceals a lot of subnational variation. Next slide, please. And this is the second point I want to mention, which is that there's a high degree of heterogeneity between countries and cities. It's not correct to talk about this region as one undifferentiated homogeneous grouping. There's significant variation in firearm-related fatalities and injuries between Mexico and the Northern Triangle, as well as amongst other Central American countries, and substantial differences within these regions in terms of both fatal and non-fatal injuries. Just take the case of cities. 85% of Latin Americans currently live in cities. It's one of the most urbanized parts of the world. And what you see here are the top 10 most violent cities relative to the national rate. Mexico and Central America have 10 of the world's top 30 most homicidal cities. And over half of those are in Mexico. Next slide. The third point is that there's a high degree of temporal variation in gun-related violence across time and space. Mexico is really interesting in the context of a long time series, because we think of Mexico often as having suffered from exceedingly high rates of homicide, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, the 1930s and 40s were actually, in a per capita terms, more violent, reaching almost 70 per 100,000 at its peak. What we saw was a relatively long-term decline in the 50s and 2000s. And this changed, as Stefania mentioned, with the declaration of the war on drugs and the spectacular increases in collective violence since then. But this slide, I think, shows you fairly emphatically the influence of potential policy shifts and exogenous shifts that may shape the curve. Next slide. There's a high fluctuation within countries, and this is a good and bad news story, right? Take the case of El Salvador, which has varied over the past decade. We saw big drops in 2011 and 2012 in the wake of a gang truce. Collective violence almost halved. But when that truce collapsed, we saw stunning increases again, and then a drop again. The point is that there's high variation. And the use of guns throughout that period oscillated from a low of 63% of all homicides to a high of 83%, which tells you a lot about the nature of actors and the context in which violence is taking place. Next slide. And we have high fluctuation across cities. Here are the top 10 again, working backwards from 2019, but few of those cities would have qualified necessarily as top 10 necessarily 10 years or even 20 years ago. What we've seen is some pretty dramatic shifts. And I think this is important. So we get over the fatalism and the sense of inevitability of violence in the region. It can be changed. Next slide, please. A fourth point to note, and I've already alluded to this, is the way gun violence is highly concentrated, highly sticky in certain places and at specific times. There's concentration within regions, within countries, within cities, within neighborhoods, and most importantly, within specific street corners. There's a very strong spatial component to many forms of gun violence. And we see a high level of clustering effects, especially amongst community or collective violence, in specific areas of marginalized or underserviced neighborhoods. In some cities like Ciudad Juarez, which was already mentioned, San Salvador, San Pedro Sula, Guatemala City, more than 90% of the homicides occur in less than 5% of the street addresses. Next slide, please. There's also clustering in specific times, but this is often underemphasized. We know that at certain times of year, there tends to be a little bit more violence than at others. And this isn't only about temperature. It's also about paydays, about holidays, about sporting events, about elections, when large numbers of people are often put into close contact. So we have to understand both the spatial and the temporal dynamics if we want to get at dealing with gun violence prevention. Next slide, please. Homicide and gender. The fifth point I want to mention, and the final major point, is really around the way gun violence is clustered among specific categories of the population, especially young males. And this was a point I think made emphatically by the previous speaker. A relatively small number of men make up the vast proportion of perpetrators. And even within gangs, a very small number of individuals in gangs tend to be the most active shooters. But men also make up, and males make up, a high proportion of the victims. And Arturo mentioned this, I think, fairly clearly. Where there's a high male homicide rate, like in El Salvador, there also tends to be a higher, proportionally higher level of lethal violence against females. And this is really, I think, important to look at the ways in which these forms of violence track. Next slide, please. And we also see the way homicides concentrated amongst younger males. the 15 to 29-year-old age group is where we tend to see the strongest clustering. And this is the group that makes up the highest proportion of both victims and perpetrators. We often see the younger men coming from lower income, disruptive, or dislocated family backgrounds, living in communities where social disorganization is prevalent. Next slide, please. As you can see here, males are significantly more at risk of homicide than females. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't look at the issues of violence against women or girls. Absolutely not. But it's just to look at the ways in which it concentrates to understand a little bit about the patterns. If you look at El Salvador, the homicide rate for males between 29 and 35 is about 419 per 100,000. Next slide, please. And I'll close here with just a very brief treatment of the costs. Beyond the human costs, there are tremendous and radiating economic impacts. And I've worked with the World Health Organization and the IDB and others for some years to come up with ways of measuring interpersonal violence. Economists of both the IDB and the World Bank have generated estimates based on a range of different methodologies, including accounting methods to look at the health costs, lost productivity, disability adjusted life years, and the rest. This slide, I think, offers a very generic breakdown of the ways in which we can start thinking about disaggregating costs. The interesting element here isn't so much the total amount, because you're always going to get somewhere between 2 and 15% of GDP. I think what's interesting is how we calculate it and how those costs expand. Next slide, please. So my goal here was to provide a very quick and dirty overview of the global burden. I think we can discuss what works in the question and answer. But I think it's important that we have a bigger and a broader sense of these trends and patterns. And if you want to get more information on homicide and some of its patterns, please do check out homicide.igape.org.br, where we have a data visualization where you can play with the data yourself. So thanks so much, and back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Robert. And I do want to pick up on the last thing that you said. First, that there will be time for more delving into these topics in the question and answer period. But I think this notion of cost and what are the human, the societal, the economic costs that we will be dealing with. I'll just give a preview to all our panelists in this session. I am going to come back to this notion of it is more than just a notion of life or death. Obviously, that's incredibly important, and injuries and all of the disabilities that are caused from gun violence are tremendously important, but there are costs that filter beyond the immediate victim of the gun violence, and that's something I do want to come back to in the Q&A. So those of you in this panel, be prepared for that discussion coming up. But we still have more speakers in this session, so I want to introduce our next speaker, Lucia Chavez. Currently, Lucia is a professor at the Universidad Tecnológica Latinoamericana and director of the research area of the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights. Since 2008, Lucia has worked in the field of human rights with civil society organizations, and from 2011 to 2014 in the office of the local ombudsman in Mexico City. In her presentation, Lucia will focus on the interrelation of human rights and gender, particularly when talking about the violation of the right to life by homicide with firearms, the right to health, and transparency. So welcome, Lucia, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very thankful for the invitation to participate in this event, which we consider not to be only important, but necessary, especially on this date, March 8th, in which we commemorate International Women's Day. In my presentation, as Rachel said, I will focus on the interrelation of human rights, particularly when we're talking about the violation of the right to life by homicide with firearms, the access to justice, the right to attain the highest possible level of health and transparency. We should stop thinking about licit and illicit arms trafficking as just a security issue. Licit and illicit arms cause death with gender differentiated consequences for men and women, as well as transgenerational consequences. The next one, please. Which means that they affect society in general, as well as future generations. Regarding to the topic of gender, we should see arms as part of the history of the phallic power, which has dominated through the use of force, among others, by using arms. In the end, whoever has arms has the resources to kill and the power to command. The submission through the use of arms has been constant throughout the history of humanity. It is a current issue that has been in Mexico for the past years due to the number of killings, their causes, and the way in which they are committed. During the last 14 years, at least, as a direct consequence of militarization, there has been an increase in organized crime-related violence and trafficking. Data from January 2021 shows over 2,000 intentional killings in the country, amounting an average of more than 76 per day. 69% of these crimes, which are equivalent to 1,600, were committed by use of firearms. Even though homicide is not the only type of violent crime, it is expression of extreme violence, and it deprives of a person's life and has a deep social significance in which it is a reflection of society major problems like inequality, impunity, corruption, organized crime, between others, and of problems in private spaces and interpersonal relationships, for example, domestic violence. The Center of Health Sciences of University of Guadalajara explains that violence is currently recognized as a public health issue, that as it is a serious social epidemic that manifests in number of killings and mortality rates, as well as intensity and variety of ways violence is exercised and expand to individual and collective life in the deterioration of living standards and the health conditions of the population. We say that in beings and
Lucia, you seem to have
communities
frozen for a
to the
moment.
increased availability to buy and use intimate and private space. Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe if
I
you
was
turn
frozen.
your
Was the
camera,
last you heard?
maybe you can turn your camera off and we can just have your voice.
Okay, can you let me go now? Yeah.
I think we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. As I was explaining, this violence that we can say that in the last decades, there has been an alarming 300% increase in homicide committed against women through the use of firearms. What we can notice is that these instruments of terror inside homes and communities have changed due to the increased availability to buy and use firearms, not only for the licit and illicit public use, but for the use inside the intimate and private spaces. With the data we just heard and other data, for example, we can confirm the need to disarm the patriarchy, since 73% of these homicides, most of them possible femicide, were committed with firearms. This public health issue, which really manifests through the use of firearms, allows us to analyze the different effects to men and women. One of the most serious things is the impunity over those crimes. Arturo already talked of that figure and told us that just a few crimes are effectively sanctioned, and victims are comprehensive repair in just few crimes. Robert also said that murder is cheap. In Mexico, it is. Some Mexicans NGOs have insisted in the need of international extraordinary mechanisms to fight the impunity. Now, the issue of transparency. In Mexican Commission of Defense and Promotion of Human Rights and Stop Arms, for years now, have asked the government for information on the legal arms trade. Some of our main conclusions are: one, the weapons are brought to the authorities in charge of security are not intended for defense, but for killing. Two, several of those weapons are lost or stolen and they end in the hands of organized crime. Three, from the analysis of cases, we have concluded that weapons are used to violate human rights and arbitrarily end with people's life. Four, much of the data is contradictory, and the same happens in the other issues such as massive graves, torture, disappearance. So it is difficult to be certain of the situation on one hand, and on the other hand, to propose under solid evidence a public policy. But even with the data we have from the context and from what we see manifest every day, we know that arms trafficking must stop. Because we are a country involved in an epidemic of things, in a humanitarian crisis of the dimension that they exist in countries with armed conflicts. And although in Mexico, there is no recognized armed conflict. And I will end saying that society, and us women in particular, experience such consequences. And I'm sorry for the video and the inconvenience of my internet.
No, it's wonderful to hear your perspective. So I think we'll all be patient with technological challenges as they arise today. It's important to have voices from around the world discussing how these issues affect their societies and communities. And so I welcome your comments today. Last but certainly not least in this panel, we have Dr. Stephen Hargarten, who is the man responsible for bringing us all together for the past year that the network has been in existence and continuing to motivate us to continue this important work. Dr. Hargarten is the Associate Dean of the Office of Global Health and Professor of Emergency Medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Dr. Hargarten has a long history of extramurally funded research in injury prevention and has published over 100 research articles, editorials, and chapters. He is the founding president of the Society for Advancement of Violence and Injury Research and a past president of the Association of Academic Chairs of Emergency Medicine, as well as having served on many expert committees and advisory task forces. Dr. Hargarten is going to make a case for using a public health model to focus on the gun and its licit and illicit movement across borders and into communities to further reduce gun injuries and deaths. So Steve, I turn it over to you to conclude this panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And it's just a great honor to be part of this, the first part of this panel, as well as this panel and satellite session affiliated with the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. And as Arturo mentioned, this journey began several years ago in Chicago with a panel that we began to discuss this important issue. And we feel that this continues to this satellite session, and we will be continuing to discuss this important issue as 2021 unfolds and beyond. The previous panelists have outlined the scope and nature of the public health and humanitarian crisis of gun violence in Mexico and Central America. This challenging and vexing problem requires all levels of civil society, leaders, and decision makers to develop, implement, and evaluate policies that help make our communities healthy and safe for everyone. Using the public health model for addressing diseases, We have seen the benefits of unpacking the disease complexities into sections or areas that provide focus and action. We see this when addressing HIV/AIDS and now COVID. Battling COVID with one strategy isn't enough. Multiple strategies are needed to attack the virus and its dissemination into our communities. We must do the same to attack gun violence. Unpacking this complex disease into sectors of focus is critically important. Fully understanding the high-risk groups, as our panelists have so eloquently outlined, such as youth, women, gang members, is essential to develop programs that help them make better decisions and steer them away from poor ones. Identifying high-risk environments. And again, Robert Mugga began that discussion of spatial variation in communities, just down to the street corner. So identifying these high-risk environments, both urban and rural, enable civic and community leaders to develop and evaluate programs and policies that help make a community safer for everyone. And it is necessary to focus on the vector of this disease, the gun, the rifles, the handguns, and the bullets they carry. Guns don't kill people, bullets do. And focusing on the vector of a disease, such as the mosquito for Zika and malaria, or the human being, as in the case of COVID, has independent value and produces positive results when coupled with other public health strategies. By focusing on the disease vector, the mosquito's environment of stagnant water is a focus for eradication, or the mosquito itself is rendered genetically incapable of transmitting the deadly virus or parasite. By focusing on the human, that is why mask wearing is so important to address COVID. Focusing on the gun and its licit and illicit movement across borders and its movement into communities has independent value if we're going to further reduce gun violence, injuries, and deaths. Research that examines this movement of guns can provide the necessary information for the development and implementation of evidence-based policies for our communities and countries in the Americas. A focus on the gun and its movements and the policies necessary to stop its illicit movement and manage its licit movement is the subject of the second half of this CUGH satellite session. And we hope all of you will be staying with us as we discuss this important strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to all of our panelists from this first session who not only provided us with really fascinating and sobering information, but also did so by staying on time, which is always great, which allows us to have a few minutes to discuss some additional points from that first panel. So I'll ask our first panelists, Robert, Steve, Arturo, Lucia, Estefania, to rejoin by turning your cameras on, or Lucia, if you want to keep yours off for the moment, or perhaps it will work okay, whatever is easiest, just to continue our discussion about impacts. And I do want to start there, and I'll just open this up to all of you. But when we think about how guns and gun violence impact communities, I wonder if you could relate some additional information, perhaps with regards to those that are affected. So we talked a lot about men and women, but there are other groups in societies that are also disproportionately affected by gun violence. So I think it'd be helpful to maybe unpack that notion a little bit, as well as what some of those impacts are beyond the deaths and injuries which I think sometimes are easier for us to understand, but also easier for us to count and to make a nice graph. It's also, very difficult to count some of the costs as they occur for years in the future, as well as it's hard to put sort of an actual quantitative value associated with them. So let me open it up to you all. I won't call on anyone at this point. And perhaps Stephanie, we'll start with you and then go to Arturo to follow.
Thank you so much. Part of the problem, and this is something that we're working with one of our sister organizations, that is Data Civica, is how we have a problem with data, both for gun violence and the case of homicides, which is the one that we have studied the most, is very telling. For example, official data on homicides in Mexico is supposed to register whether a long or short gun was used. But in 99% of the cases, this basic information is not included. On the other hand, when you look at victims, for example, we have basic problems of intersectionality. To give one example, it wasn't until 2012 where our homicide data started recording whether the victim spoke an indigenous language or not. And in 25% of the cases, they still don't register whether or not they speak an indigenous language. If we look at LGBTQ folks, of course they are invisible. If we look at men and women with disabilities, of course they are invisible. So we have, if we want to really assess the impact of firearms, one of the things that needs to be in our agenda is overall improving data on homicides and, of course, other violences. I didn't focus on other violences because that's another place in which we have a lot of problems. For example, we're supposed to have information on the impact of gun violence in injuries that end up in hospitalizations. But the data on hospitalizations in Mexico only covers certain hospitals of the public sector. We have no idea what is happening with private hospitals. We don't even have an idea of what's happening with all public hospitals. So if we really want that nitty-gritty, we need better data, and data that takes into account the differences in people and the differences in community. And as everybody mentioned, also the differences in violence and things we don't catalog as violence, but we know that there's an impact, such as accidents and suicides, for example.
I would comment, Rachel, on when discussing violence and specifically the impacts of gun violence, I think we have to do it within the context of complex systems. Violence generates both positive and negative feedback loops. And I think that the impacts can be reflected specifically in countries such as the Mexico and Central America region, that reflects on poverty, on migration, on impunity and the destruction of the rule of law, on the proliferation of organized crime, on the accentuation of inequality. And that is strengthened by the violence that reaps at multiple levels of the ecosystem. Violence is known to have impacts not only in the individual himself, but in his immediate family members. It destroys the individual and it harms him, but also it has impacts on his immediate family and in his neighborhood and community. And things keep getting on a feedback loop cycle that makes violence have stronger impacts throughout the life course and in multiple levels of the ecosystem. So it's a complex system, it's a complex problem, thus the need to address it scientifically.
Thank you, Arturo. Anyone else want to discuss? Steve, is that okay? I'll let you.
Just make a brief comment to build on Estefania's very important comment about the importance of data. Solid data is the hallmark and the benchmark of solving any complex public health problem. And without the data, you're unable to really identify the characteristics that Robert started to identify in terms of spatial variations and so forth, and also the data about the characteristics of the gun. Where did the gun come from? How did it get to the community and so forth? So I overemphasize that important comment that Estefania made about the importance of data.
And I think this notion of a systemic approach in our next panel, when we talk about policies, certainly this public health approach, Steve, that you talked about, but also as Robert talked about, sort of a holistic view of gun violence, that it's not enough to just look at each particular incident in isolation, that there are some trends and some systems that we can identify that are particularly problematic, but yet we need to be flexible enough to address the particular peculiarities of a given situation, of those demand factors, not just the supply factors as well. Yes, please, Robert.
I wasn't going to weigh in because I've been thinking about this for, I know you're going after me here 20 years. So I will be very, very brief, but I think that the starting point, that helps is to understand that we often measure what we treasure. We focus on those things that are most observable. And then from there, we develop a set of assumptions and estimations. And so, of course, nothing's more certain than and biologically evident than a bullet in the body or a corpse on the ground. So therefore, we tend to stop with those things that are most immediately obvious. And then injuries follow, and then all the other stuff happens later. And I think that's a challenge. And I think it's sometimes when you get too big, when the number, I remember Miller did these studies talking about 150, 200, 300, 400, 500 billion dollars, you start losing your audiences. And so sometimes it's better to be more parsimonious and talk about the particular kinds of costs, depending on the policy audience you're speaking to, attach a monetary figure to that, as reprehensible and unethical as that may seem to some people, in order to generate the kind of policy outcome you want. So how we measure what we measure, how we communicate what we measure, I think will change depending on the audiences with whom we speak to. But I think one thing that I've noticed over years and years of studying this stuff is the ways in which it radiates out from the individual to the family, to the relatives, to the loved ones, to the communities. The unbelievable corrosive impacts that gun violence have on the social and economic tissue of a community, the ways in which social cohesion and more importantly, even social efficacy, the norms that regulate behaviors within communities become upended and sometimes deracinated, disconnected in the wake of extreme levels of violence. And then there's a third element, which I think we're just starting to understand now with new neurological research and deeper, the merging of different disciplines, is the intergenerational consequences of violence, not just in terms of the social stigmas associated with people who come or may be affected by gun violence in the course of their lives, but the ways in which violence is transmitted across generations because of the extreme stress in which families or communities or victims are exposed. And I think we're just starting to get through imaging techniques of the brain and the ways in which the brain releases or secretes serotonin or dopamine. We're starting to understand different pathways. And so I think it's really important that yes, we have data and that we measure what we can, but that we also are very conscious about the audiences with whom we're speaking and the policy change that we're trying to generate, because sometimes we can lose people if we get too broad, and sometimes we miss the point if we get too specific. So there's a role here for the theory community as well as the policy and the advocacy community, and hopefully a nice harmony that can be worked out between them.
Thanks, Robert. I think that's really helpful. As many of you were speaking, I was thinking about sort of cycles of violence and cycles of violence within the region, within particular countries and communities. And we see, for example, all of the secondary or tertiary results of gun violence, whether it's increased immigration or migration flows, whether it is poverty, joblessness, a lack of foreign investment in communities where gun violence rates are high, which leads to that cycle continuing as people look to violence to get what they need and what they want to survive. I think it is quite challenging to not look at these issues holistically. And I think as Dr. Hargarten talked about in terms of public health policy, and I was struck by your you're referring to the mask as, and wearing masks right now as a key element of sort of a public health approach. And I'm thinking of images I saw this weekend of people burning their masks and sort of throwing their hands up at the science behind the transmission of COVID-19. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more, Steve, and then I'll open it to the others on this public health approach? What might it look like? What do you want people who are listening to consider as they think about gun violence as a public health crisis?
I think we've started that conversation by describing the scope and nature of this disease, this public health burden, as the panelists have done so nicely. That's the way to start it. And then research is so imperative. And research funding in this area has been very, very challenging here in the United States, as well as I think across the globe. And Robert, you may have some comments about that as well. It's challenging, but for any complex problem, it deserves thoughtful scientific inquiry to help understand the scope and nature of this disease, identifying high-risk groups, identifying communities, and then implement these programs and policies to address those changes and then reevaluate them. That's the classic public health approach for solving complex problems. We need, and hopefully some of the participants are engaged in this now and perhaps see this as a way for them to unfold their careers, to come to universities and to work with researchers and community activists to address this complex problem. So I see this as being encouraging to see young people joining this important effort. I think it's important to get the resources to be able to do it. And it's important to have a complexity of content experts like we have on these panels to address it in a comprehensive way and a systems way, as Arturo has mentioned, and as we're going to be hearing from our panelists at the second half.
Thank you. I think, Lucia, you wanted to jump in on this question as well.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. I want to add just something that if we see this like as a disease, we have to name that disease. In Mexico, we have the consequence of the humanitarian consequences of an armed conflict. But we are not officially in an armed conflict, or we have not officially crimes against humanity. So we have to name that. We have to do more research or impulse to the ICC, tell something about the situation in Mexico, but we have to name the disease.
What, if I might add something, Rachel? Yes. I think it's very important to look at this issue within the context of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, not only number 16 specifically that deals with reducing all sorts of violence, but Agenda 2030 seen as a group of interrelated objectives that we should focus on for the next decade in Latin America. And it includes the topics such as arms, illegal arms trade and trafficking. It includes the monetary flows. It includes working to have strong institutions and access to the rule of law. So there's many things that are joined together in Agenda 2030 as a beautiful scope, and specifically SDG 16 plus and the Pathfinders effort, which helps us have a common goal for the next 10 years, because this is a long-term challenge that will require multi-sector collaboration.
I think that's a really important point, and I'm looking in the Q&A, and some of the questions will be answered in the next set of presentations in panel 2. So I will come back to them. But there was a question about the impact of gun-related crimes and violence beyond individual victims. So whether that's businesses, the question noted the impact on transportation and the inability of people to move safely from different locations in the Americas. I'm wondering if you all could talk about how these issues continue to affect communities and societies from being able to rebuild, but also for a much longer period of time. Going back to Robert's point about the temporal piece of this, is it takes a lot to have this whole of government or the systemic approach to the solutions beyond just sort of the immediate violence itself. Yeah, so Robert and then Estefania.
Yeah, just first of all, I want to sort of underline the point that Stephen made about diagnosis, testing, and evaluation. You know, I think that's the virtuous cycle, and that the more we can encourage our researchers and others to do it, and to think about this problem in that way, I think the better. And the good news, I think, is, just to respond to that point, is that we've seen big shifts, I think, over the last 20, 25 years that I've been working on this issue. The level and quality of data is dramatically better than it used to be. New data analytics and cloud computing and ways and means and innovations to capture data have increased. I'm not suggesting it's great. I think we've got a long way to go, but I do think there's been a great improvement. I think showing the outcomes, both the positive and negative, or the null outcomes, is incredibly important. So again, a role for science in demonstrating what works, and really importantly here, and this is, I'm going to answer the question, Rachel, what doesn't work, because I think often we tend to focus only on that small subset of interventions. I'm going to speak a little slower here. So we focus on the smaller number of interventions that generate promise, but we don't often focus on those that do not. So when it comes to the costs and the layers of costs, I actually think that the work that's coming out of the Inter-American Development Bank, or the World Bank, or the great research institutions, some of whom are represented here, are really advancing our knowledge about not just the superficial hospitalization and rehabilitation, but also the public and private security costs. You know, recall that there are 2 private security guards for every public police officer in Latin America, sometimes 3 or 4. Those have costs. The insurance premiums, the real estate costs. So I think you're seeing more and more of this sophisticated debate occurring in the media. But I would also attach, there is still in this region, and certainly in the United States, a deep symbolic attachment to firearms, a cultural fixation within certain segments of the population, and a range of myths that continue to get propagated around a gun in the home, around male patriarchy and having a gun, around gun for self-defense in the car. And of course, there's a lobby, a very clear political economy shaping that, and it's been in the States for decades, but it's very much present in parts of the world where I work. And so I think we need to mobilize the evidence. Sure, we need to be able to demonstrate the positive outcomes of interventions that work and those that don't, and perhaps I'll have a chance to talk about that later. But I think we also need to get better at the politics of the issue, and that may not be the role for some scientists necessarily in all cases, but we have to get sharper in our argumentation. And it may, I mean, I can't tell you, for 25 years I've been saying in some cases the same things about the risks associated with the gun in the home, or the risks associated with the gun in self-defense, and how it's more likely to injure you or your spouse or your child than it is to, you know, injure somebody else. But I think we have to get savvier and smarter about challenging the myths. And it's not just by shoving the information and the evidence in front of people. We have to get sharper and smarter about how we communicate that. So just a call for action in addition to mobilizing evidence.
Let me add in the call to action, Robert, because one of the myths is that this is an inevitable problem. And the gun industry, 8 corporations that are producing 8 million weapons every year, and that 47% of all the shops, more than 60,000 small arms shops that you will hear in the next part of the panel, that are distributing weapons that they knowingly know are coming to Mexico, that's a human rights violation. That's a very basic bad public nuisance case of the United States as the major contributor of this agent and the vectors for homicide and crime and chaos in the Northern Triangle.
Let me turn to Estefania, who wanted to jump in on this question as well.
I think I'm going to end up echoing some of what Robert said. The question about the impact on businesses reminded me of a discussion that we had 2 years ago in the country. And that has to do with the solutions that we should not pursue. So in the Mexican Constitution, we have mandatory pretrial detention, which according to every single international human rights body is a flagrant human rights violation. No? This is the possibility of incarcerating people that are innocent merely because of the crime for which they are being investigated. And one of the drivers that justified narratively this reform was precisely the impact on businesses of robberies committed with firearms. And the discussion was entirely dominated on the pro side of the reform by the big business conglomerates who used to put videos of robberies being committed to sort of like up the emotional toll and justify what is a human rights violation. So I think I'm not denying, again, the impact on businesses, but I think it is also important to acknowledge how in the name of reducing firearm violence, other human rights violations can be committed. And I also mentioned this again to drive the point home about militarization. You know, it's about, so the strategy was deployed against armed drug trafficking groups. No? But you see that it's a strategy that depends entirely on more and bigger arms. So as a feminist organization, we cannot but stress the irony of the macho approach to solving problems with bigger arms and bigger muscle and bigger tanks. That's what we're doing, no? So I think that in answering the other question about one of the advantages of understanding this as a public health problem, as a feminist organization, so for example, in abortion, when you go away from the criminal law focus to the public health focus, it's much easier to not just focus on carceral interventions or more firearm interventions, but actually look at the individual social, economic impact of these things. And just to echo Robert, this also includes, and we haven't mentioned it, and it's important in this day, who commits these crimes. And one of the most common characteristics of those that own guns and those that commit the crimes is that they're men. So we also need a focus on masculinity and the emotional, social, economic attachment to masculinity and gun violence. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I don't lose that point. I want to come back to that point, and not just because it's International Women's Day, but I want to because I think it's an important point about how we approach policy solutions that I see in the chat. Robert put smarter messaging, sharper litigation. The arguments of the last 25 years where we have seen gun violence not only continue, but exacerbated in communities that have already suffered tremendously. We have to try new approaches. We have to look at these root causes and message specifically to the perpetrators of the violence. We all have the empathy and sympathy for those who are affected, but that is clearly not enough to spur political action or personal action in some cases. So I want to come back to that point in our Q&A. I want to give Lucia the last word before we turn to our second panel. I promise second panel, you will not be shortchanged. I will give you your entire period of time, but I want Lucia to have the last word before we continue.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, I'm agree with Estefania because firearms do not only represent power when they are shot against body of a woman, of a child, and this is linked. The militarization processes And the possession of a firearm is linked with dominant masculinity because it is a threat for the environment. It is like the head of household has a firearm with the power to submit, with the power to kill. And as Estefania said, the most of the crimes of the feminicides and the murders are committed for men. For example, we have some data that said that, for example, in Samar, in Secretaría de Marina, there are 20% of women, but only a very few women of Secretaría de Marina have access to an arm. 1,000 of there are administrative personnel. So the responsible for using firearms to kill and are for trafficking are men. So, well, it is, I think it's a gender issue.
Yes, thank you. And I see that Robert's putting some really interesting points in the chat, and I will probably ask his indulgence to put them in the chat again when we get back to the Q&A, so we don't lose them, because I do think when we're talking at the conclusion of the second panel about what works and what doesn't work, we don't need to revisit many of the policy prescriptions or programmatic efforts that have been tried and have failed for the last 25 years. And I saw there was a Nancy Reagan reference, so that's even farther, longer ago than 25 years to date ourselves a little bit here. So I would like us to transition to our second panel. Please join me in thanking our first panel. They will be back, so do not worry, we have more to discuss with them, but thank you all for your really thoughtful interventions and committed efforts to addressing issues of gun violence today and in the future. So I do want to transition to our second panel and to allow our second panel to get ready to join us. I know that we have had many people join since we began, and so I want to remind you that you can listen to today's webinar in both Spanish and or English by simply choosing the language at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may ask questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom screen on the bottom, or provide comments in the chat, whatever is most convenient to you. All of these are being monitored. We will have our presentations now for our second panel, Understanding the Movement of Guns, the Impact of the Gun Trade and Policy Paths to Solutions. So as I promised, we will start to look at these issues from a policy perspective. Now, as we did with the first panel, I will introduce each speaker before their presentation and let you know what the presentation will be about. And at the conclusion, we will open it more broadly to questions. So first, we will hear from Eugenio Weigand, who is the Research Director for Gun Violence Prevention at the Center for American Progress. His research has focused on preventing arms trafficking and gun violence in the United States and Mexico. Prior to joining CAP, Eugenio was a researcher at Instituto Tecnológico y de Estudios Superiores de Monterrey, where he focused his research on mitigating violence across Mexican states. Eugenio's presentation today will focus on evidence that puts the US as the main supplier of crime guns to Mexico and other countries. He will then focus on explaining why. First, the rise in gun production as well as gun imports. Second, gaps along the supply chain, and then highlighting some policy recommendations for the US to mitigate the illegal gun trade. So Eugenio, I am pleased to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks for the Consortium of Universities for Global Health for putting this panel together, and particularly to Dr. Hargarten and Tiffany for working to make this happen during the last month. As Rachel said, I'm going to focus more on what the United States can do, but recognizing, of course, that the countries that receive the guns have also a role to play. They need to analyze their internal factors and come up with some policy solutions as well. But my research has focused more on the US side. Please go to the next slide. So I want to echo what people have already highlighted on the previous panel, and that is that gun violence in Mexico has risen, particularly in the mid-2000s, 2007, 2008. Stefania highlighted the percentages of gun homicides perpetrated with Mexico with a gun. And you can see here that in 2004, that percentage was around 25%. And now in 2018, 2019, that's been closer to around 70%. And that gun violence in Mexico has gone beyond homicides. You see an increase in robberies. When you look at the victimization surveys, you see that guns have been, the use of guns has been increasing across the last 10 years, and also with gun-related threats. So gun violence has become an issue, and a very important issue in Mexico. Next slide, please. The United States here plays a very important role. If you look at data from the Bureau of Tobacco, Alcohol, Firearms, and Explosives, they get guns that are recovered in Mexico every year, and then they are traced using their e-trace system. And what has resulted from that is that in the last 10 years, the percentage of guns that originate in the United States, that are used in Mexico and originate in the United States, has been constantly around 70%. So that really does put the United States as a very important supplier of gun to Mexico. Now, the other 30% is really an undetermined origin. So that does not mean that they did not originate in the United States. There is a possibility that many of those guns also originated in the United States. Next slide, please. It is also important to highlight that Mexico is not the only source of US guns in the region. You see examples of, gun rings being dismantled in Brazil, guns bought legally in the US are arming narcos in Colombia. There are reports of guns being found in Guatemala, and even in Chile, with the country that is located the furthest south in the continent, there has been some examples of US reaching those parts of the region. And there are a lot of other pieces of information that put the United States as a very important source of crime guns to this region. Not only the ATF data, not only examples of guns being recovered in other countries, but if you go to the next slide, please. You also see the manufacturing of firearms in recent years. There's a significant boom in guns being manufactured around the 2008. Just to give you an idea, the annual average of guns produced from 1986 to 2008 was 3.8 million guns every year. That annual average from 2009 to 2018 rose to 8.4 million. That is more than double the production in the last 10 years. The United States has more than doubled that production. And you see a very similar pattern on gun imports as well. Now, what's really interesting here is that if you break down the production of those guns, you see that the rise has been driven by rifles and high caliber pistols. These are weapons that are often preferred by criminal groups and organized crime in countries like Mexico and Central America. Can you go to the next slide, please? You also see that this rise in production, gun production in the United States, is linked to the rise in homicides in Mexico, particularly when you break it down by gun homicides. The correlation is really high. I know correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but there's a lot of evidence that supports this. Not only journalist activities, you go into the ATF press release and you see that they have done some work on disrupting gun trafficking rings in Texas, Arizona that were meant to go to Mexico. There's also academic evidence, and Robert here has been author of studies that do highlight the amount of guns that are purchased in the United States with the intent to be sent to Mexico. Robert put out an interesting paper back in 2013, where he highlighted an annual average of close to 213,000 guns between 2010 and 2012. That means that there's also academic evidence that backs this, the points that I'm trying to highlight here, that place the United States as a major supplier of crime guns. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to the high level of production that the United States has seen in recent years, there's also gaps in the supply chain. If you go from the manufacturers and imports all the way to when guns exchange hands between private citizens, there are gaps that allow guns to be diverted diverted to secondary markets, et cetera. So starting with manufacture and importation, there was a law back in 2004 that was removed. The United States had an assault weapons ban from 1994 to 2004. After that, the commercialization of assault weapons were not prohibited. And that had a direct impact in Mexico. There are, again, academic studies that have highlighted that the removal of the assault weapons ban in 2004 in the United States was directly linked to the increase in homicides in Mexican municipalities that border Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. What's interesting is that it was not the case for California, because California maintained its own state level ban on assault weapons. Now, let's not forget that these assault weapons, again, are the weapons of choice for many criminal groups in Mexico and Central America. Now, if you look at the next step in the supply chain, during the stage where the guns are with the FFL dealers, there's a lot of guns that are stolen or that are reported missing in this part of the supply chain. From 2012 to 2019, 139,000 firearms were reported stolen or missing from FFL dealers. There's also a major lack of oversight in the United States. Just to give you an idea, in 2019, the ATF, which is the agency in charge of monitoring gun trafficking in the United States, was only able to inspect 13% of FFL dealers. That means that close to 87% were not inspected. Therefore, there couldn't be inventory conciliation, and FFLs can simply lose guns within their inventory with no consequences. There's also that transaction from the FFL dealers to the private gun owners. And in here, first of all, there's no limitation on the number of guns that a person can purchase in many of the US states. It's important to highlight here that the United States laws are federal. Yes, the federal government provides some floor and some standards for federal laws, but then the states can go further and implement their own state level laws. So in here, many states do not have a limit on the number of guns that can be purchased. So a person can purchase multiple guns in a short period of time. Now, there is a law that FFL dealers have to report to the ATF when in a short period of time, a person purchased multiple handguns. This is not the case for long guns, with the exception of the 4 border states. Now, this gap allows for people to purchase, for example, multiple AR-15s in Oklahoma, in Florida, without raising any flags to the ATF, and then they can be easily trafficking. Now, this is important because the purchase of multiple guns in a short period of time is usually a sign of trafficking. The other problem that we see on this part of the supply chain is the straw purchasing. A person that is in charge that can legally purchase a gun and usually does so on behalf of a third person, usually a prohibited person. Now, there's also the instance with private gun owners. A lot of guns are stolen from private gun owners, close to 300,000 per year. And then finally, on the transaction between private gun owners, in many of the states, no background check are required. Background checks help prevent people that are prohibited by law, by federal law, from purchasing a gun. So, for example, if people have a history of domestic violence, or if people have a history of substance abuse, among other categories that would make a person prohibited. So, by law, FFLs run background checks, but that's not always the case at gun shows or sales on internet where people can just exchange hands with no questions asked. So I'm kind of highlighting all these gaps because these are the challenges that you see within the United States, but within these challenges come also the solutions. If you go to the next slide, please. Also, before I turn into the solutions, I also want to highlight this, that the United States does some job on tracing guns within the United States, but also guns that are recovered abroad. The problem is that once they're recovered, there are limitations about the data that can be shared. And this is not a minor concern. It's very relevant to know in what state and county within the United States the gun originated. It's also important to highlight the type of gun. Stefania was highlighting on the previous panel the importance of knowing long guns versus handguns. This is also a very important piece of information that needs to be shared in order to tackle and detect gun trafficking from the United States, within the United States, and from the United States abroad. And even highlighting the FFL dealer that sold the gun originally. So now, next slide to the policy solutions. Some basic policy recommendations are obviously banning the assault weapons and high capacity magazines, better security requirements for FFLs, and more oversight of licensed gun dealers. So the 139,000 guns that were missing or reported don't happen again. Background checks, and I want to highlight here that background checks not only of guns, but including also the purchase of ammunition. As Dr. Harganin mentioned, bullets are a major problem as well. And the reporting of multiple long gun sales outside of the border states. The requirement to report stolen guns and better data sharing and analysis. And just to conclude, next slide, please. The United States, in addition to moral reasons, they should implement these policies because they would not only reduce gun trafficking to Mexico and Central America, but they would also reduce violence within the United States, a country that was mentioned at the beginning also suffers from gun violence. These policies are supported by the US population. In addition, like I said, some can be implemented at a state level as well. So these recommendations don't necessarily have to go to the federal level, but also recommendations for states to implement them. And in addition, like Estefania said, reducing gun trafficking would reduce other issues that intertwine with US interests. Like Estefania said, the United States is sending guns to arm the military in order to disrupt gun trafficking, but it's not doing anything to disrupt the access to criminal groups, which is a contradiction, and I agree with Stefania in that sense. So there are many reasons, in addition to simply stopping gun trafficking, for the United States to implement these recommendations. And with that, I'll leave it for future questions and answers. Just additional information here.
Thank you, Eugenio. I think particularly your last two slides there will be quite relevant as we're talking in the Q&A section about what do we do. I think often in panels or events like this, we spend an enormous amount of time laying out what the challenges and the problems are. And I always like to come out of these kinds of sessions feeling hopeful and not hopeless about the problems being so great that we sort of throw our hands up. And we started to allude to some of those policy solutions in the first panel, but I thank you for bringing your presentation at the end back to what do we do about this? The challenges are real and diverse, and I think as you made clear, there's not one way in which weapons flow from the US to Mexico, but that also means there's not just one way that we address these challenges resulting from diverted or legal or even illegal guns. So we will pick up on some of those issues in the Q&A. And I see there's a request, these last slide links in the chat for copy and paste. So we will make sure that this material is available. But next, we will hear from John Lindsay Poland, who coordinates the Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico project of global exchange and works for police demilitarization with the California Healing Justice Program of the American Friends Service Committee in Oakland, California. And we've talked about demilitarization quite a few times, so John's expertise is certainly welcome. John's research focuses on U.S. foreign military assistance and military bases and respect for human rights, and he has more than 35 years experience working on these issues. So in his remarks, John will address the legal flows of firearms to Mexico and the lack of transparency and controls on the end users of those weapons. So John, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I want to give a little credit, a shout out to the graphic that you saw in the previous slide, which was produced by Silvia Mengusi, an artist in Colorado, which I think says just very visually what some of our aspirations are. So I'm going to focus a lot on guns as a market, and especially around the international market, the export and import market. But also, if you can go to the next one, I want to say something about the sort of to add a point to what Eugenio was saying about the illegal trafficking, because both the United States and Mexico, their highest priorities have to do with illegal trade. They are trade partners of over $500 billion worth of commerce over the border every year. And this means that picking out some contraband from within that market that is a priority for both countries is an enormous challenge. It's a technical challenge, but even more so, it is a political challenge to make it a priority. If you want to detect these things at the border, then you are going to slow down these trucks, these thousands and thousands and thousands of trucks and trains and cars that cross the border every single day. You can go to the next one. So a lot of what we see is illustrated in this map, which is on our website. You can see the link there, which is around the retail trade, right? So the enormous number of gun dealers near the border, often in very small towns. So those black icons represent the number of gun dealers per municipality in the US border states. And then the red icons represent the number of firearms recovered per municipality in Mexico over a 9-year period. And there's a relationship, obviously, between these two, and it is a market relationship. There is a market for violence. And if we are going to design market interventions, then we need to understand that market better. So if you can go to the next one. And I want to say at the outset that this market is based, whether we're talking about in Mexico or we're talking about within the United States, it is based on a fear narrative. And so I'm going to come back to that later. But that is what is fueling a lot of the drive to acquire firearms, whether we're talking about acquisitions by security forces, police and military, or whether we're talking about it by organized crime, or whether we're talking about it by private citizens. Of course, there's also a profit motive involved. So this just shows the US legal exports of firearms, not parts, munitions and explosives from the United States to Mexico in the last 19 years. And you can see that there's an enormous rise at the point at which, as Stephanie and others have noted, the Mexican military got involved in the drug war. The President Calderon declared a drug war, and there was a bilateral initiative. This was not it was an assistance initiative, but it resulted in an enormous number of firearms and related goods that were sold from the United States to Mexico. When these are sold, there is only one legal importer in Mexico, which is the Mexican Army. The Navy can also import for their own use, but the Army is the only importer of all firearms from any part of the world. And the Army also concentrates an enormous amount of authority over firearms. They import firearms, they produce firearms, they use firearms, they confiscate firearms, they sell firearms to police, they sell firearms to private citizens, they keep a registry of firearms, and they keep a registry of confiscated firearms. So the Mexican Army has an enormous amount of authority over firearms in the country. If you can go to the next slide, please. So the United States is not the only legal supplier. Mexican police, because in part because of restrictive firearms possession rules and laws within Mexico, the Mexican police are one of the biggest sectors to acquire firearms in Mexico. And the biggest supplier by company of guns to the Mexican police is an Italian company, Beretta. Glock and Sig Sauer are also enormous suppliers. But an important piece of this is that because of the US domestic gun market, all of these European gun companies have set up manufacturing within the United States. And in addition, the United States is an easier place from which to export their weapons to the rest of the world. Tomorrow marks the first anniversary of a rule change in the United States for firearm exports around the world, in which firearms that were under the authority and oversight of the US State Department and what's called the US munitions list were transferred a year ago to the Commerce Department with looser rules, less transparency, no notification to Congress of these firearm sales. And as a result, semi-automatic pistol sales globally have more than doubled in the second six months of 2020 versus the same period in 2019. So the US gun industry, joined by European producers, is using looser export rules in order to grow its market share and its markets in general around the world and in Mexico and specifically. If you can go to the next slide. So one of the aspects of this is when a gun is exported legally, or a set of guns, the company and the buyer are supposed to produce end user certificates to say, okay, where is this gun going? It's the same principle as in the United States. If you buy a gun, you're not supposed to have a felony on your record. You're not supposed to be a domestic abuser. You're not supposed to be a minor. You're supposed to be a citizen. That's in order to control where the guns are going. In the case of end user certificates for the United States, unfortunately, there is a problem in which these weapons, the end user certificate is sent to the producer of the gun. So in this case, these were guns that were produced by Cult Manufacturing in Connecticut, and they were being shipped to state police in Guerrero and Veracruz and other states in Mexico, where state police are heavily implicated in human rights violations and organized crime. The company knew where they were going. In this case, these are rifles that are going to the Guerrero police 4 months, for a little over 4 months after those state police were implicated in one of the most scandalous human rights cases in the last decade in Mexico, the disappearance of 43 student teachers. So the company knew, if you can go to the next slide. However, the end user certificate that was submitted by the Mexican Army to the State Department showed the Mexican Army as the end user. Every single end user certificate that is submitted to the US government by Mexico that is going to be used by police, where the firearms are going to be used by police, shows the Army as the end user, even though the Army is acquiring the weapons and then selling them to state and municipal police, including the most corrupt and human rights violating police in the country. So this is a problem that the two sides, the two governments, need to resolve in order to control where the weapons are going. There need to be fewer weapons, because we've seen how both in the illegal trade and in the legal trade, the more weapons there are in play, the more violence there's going to be, including what most would consider illegitimate violence. Weapons are durable goods. They're not like drugs, they're not like bullets that are consumed. They last a long time. And one of the consequences of that is what Lucia was talking about earlier, of the diversion of firearms after they are legally exported and sold within Mexico. I would argue that it's not only diversion of the firearms, it is also where police are protecting illegal enterprises. If you can go to the next slide. So one of the companies that we are most concerned about is Sig Sauer. It's located in New Hampshire. It's a German-owned company, but it has ceased manufacture in Germany and now is primarily manufacturing in the United States. And in 2015, got a license to export up to $265 million worth of firearms to Mexico, particularly to the Navy, which were going to be assembled. These have been used by the Navy in a number of different incidents in Tamaulipas on the Texas border. If you can go to the next slide. But they were also transferred to state police in Mexico, who operated in a massacre in September of 2019, where 8 people were killed. And then it was made to look like a fight with organized crime. There are now state police agents who were charged, but have not been tried in that crime. If you go to the next slide. Now, we know from receipts that we have acquired from the Mexican army that even after that crime, that massacre of 8 people, that Sig Sauer rifles continued to be transferred to the Tamaulipas State Police after they were known to have been participating in that massacre. And then as a result, if you can go to the next slide, they were implicated in another crime. So now I'm going to shift here just to say that this Catherine Aguirre will talk about guns going to Central America, but one of the consequences of that gun flow is the flow of forced migration from Central America through Mexico. They have to pass through Mexico in order to get to a safe location. 2/3 of the Central American migrants who pass through Mexico report having experienced violence in Mexico. Next slide. And as a result, they need to get to the United States. They need to get to a safer location. And the approach of both the Mexican government, mostly in response to US pressure, and the US government and society, is this fear narrative that migrants are dangerous and therefore they cannot be allowed to pass freely. Now, we believe in the right to migrate as well as the right to stay in one's own location. If you can go to the next slide. One of the outcomes of this was in January, where some of the women who were killed in public spaces that Estefania talked about were, in this case, migrants, Guatemalan migrants, who were seeking to get to the United States, and within a few miles of the United States were killed by Tamaulipas State Police, again, the next slide, who were armed with Sig Sauer rifles. This is a special operations group who are the same unit that were involved in the massacre in September 2019. And yet they continued to be armed by legally exported firearms. So if you can go 2 more slides, just something about the policy recommendations. First is we need to have adequate mechanisms to identify and vet the end users of legally exported firearms. Second, to return the oversight of firearms export to the State Department, which has a whole different set of rules for governing firearms exports that can stop some of those sketchy exports. And I also want to just mention one other thing in terms of the illegal flow, which has to do with prohibiting the importation into the United States of assault rifles, which is something that the executive branch can do without congressional action. And I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can talk more during the Q&A.
Thanks, John. I think we're always left with the what do we do? How do we address these challenges? So I appreciate as you laid out so carefully the different routes and flows and sources of weapons that we do need to, again, at the end of this, return to what do we do? How do we address these very multifaceted challenges? But before we do that, we still have two panelists to go. So I am delighted to welcome Catherine Aguirre, who is a Colombian economist with professional experience in the areas of violence and development. Catherine leads the network Amasuru Women in Security and Defense in Latin America and the Caribbean. Catherine's interests include citizen security in Latin America, violence data, monitoring violence prevention and reduction initiatives, and studying post-conflict violence. I'm very pleased that Catherine will present possibilities of diversion and misuse of firearms with identified cases in Central America, in addition with possible entry points of solutions. So again, solution-oriented, which is wonderful. So I will turn it over to you now for your remarks.
Thank you, Rachel. And I just will start on saying that I am extremely happy and proud to join this amazing group of researchers. And thank you for the invitation. Then I am going to focus on Central America, and it's very important to highlight that both the presentations of Eugenio and John illustrates a lot this problem that we are going to see all these cases also in Central American countries, and not to forget that the flow of firearms from the state to Mexico also arrive to Central America. Next. So this is a graph that we already saw. It is very clear that Central American countries, even with important reductions in the latest years, it is between the countries with the highest homicide rates in the world. And this graphic, what it shows is that when we have the highest levels of violence, in the years with the highest levels of violence, we have the highest proportion of homicide by firearms. So firearms is an issue in Central America. And just to let you know that this graph, this pattern holds for all the regions in the world. Next. I am going to present here this framework of diversion that it really follows a lot the presentation of supply chain of Eugenio. So we are going to talk about kind of the same flows and perspectives. Here on diversion, I am talking about all these possibilities of the leaks from the legal to the illegal markets, but also considering that these weapons could be not used, misused, or used by criminals in criminal actions for individuals and for groups. And that in Central America, of course, we identify organized groups related with drug trafficking and urban gangs. So starting with this perspective, we have that there are many possibilities of leak of diversion starting from the production, and this was very illustrated by John when we have diversion to countries that are not allowed to receive weapons, that are in embargo, that are in conflict, but also many of the cases of falsified use of documentation. Then when the firearms arrive to the state and the state transfer to the other actors, we can see from the security forces and private security countries, companies, the relationship of corrupt members that are associated with criminal groups, but also the poor supervision and mismanagement of warehouse and stockpiles, allowing a lot of firearms are stolen from these warehouses. In relation to civilians, as it was highlighted by Eugenio, many weapons are stolen, but also if the registers, if the permits are outdated, we lost the oversight and the control of these firearms. Following, for example, the case of the US, when we have all these firearms arriving to Mexico, they continue crossing the border and trafficking, but also many cases of firearms arriving by mail, arriving in parts and camouflage in other goods. Next. So I am going to show you the cases we identified in this frame in Central America. And I will start with the case of the transfer in a case that really touches my reality. For example, and it was a lot of time ago, a big shipping of rifles, 3,000, arrived in a ship of Chiquita Banana to Colombian paramilitaries. And how this happened? This happened with the use of falsified documentation from the Panama police and involving Nicaragua Army and Guatemala sellers. So this has happened in Central America. In relationship with security forces, in addition to the weapons owned by the security forces, the firearms that are accumulated as seized and confiscated weapons, there are a lot of documentation, mainly from press reports, of how these firearms have been stolen from these warehouses, but also there is a lot of evidence of the relationship of officials with the criminal actors. And then we have a lot of evidence of the real use of official and military weapons of these criminal groups. For the case of private security companies, this is especially important for Central America. For example, there is a report of the Inter-American Dialogue showing that 40% of illegal firearms in circulation in El Salvador are coming from these private security companies. Private security companies that could have even more firearms than the official stockpiles. In relationship with civilians, we don't have a lot of documentation of stolen weapons, but of course, we can assume that many of the firearms that are not, don't have updated documentation are of control of the state. Next, and let's don't forget that Central America has a special case of flow, which is the remnants of civil wars. Even if Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua had a very comprehensive DDR programs, still there were not complete destruction, and we can assume that many of these weapons of the civil wars are flowing into the space. So regarding entry points, using the same frame, we could start talking about all the agreements and treaties and bilateral agreements that are at the international level, just to highlight the plan of action and the Arms Trade Treaty that puts a lot of emphasis on information sharing and in all the perspectives that should be taken into account to control these transfers. This is very important in Central America, for example, in the agreements in the frame of CUGH. But also in the security forces and private security companies, there should be a lot of efforts to improve the sanctions of these corrupt agents, both in the official side and in the private security companies related with this deviation and abuses, as shown by John very clearly, but a lot in the measures of management of storehouses and stockpile. There is a lot of efforts, but not too much applied in the reality, as we see as many firearms have been stolen. But this is the relation not only on the buildings, but also in the improvement on all the systems of documentation, registration, and follow-up of the firearms. Regarding civilians, also all these measures that we could have to have a better track of the possession of the firearms, on the responsible use of the firearms. But here also we have the biggest group, I would think, on arms control that we recognize in Latin America, and many of the questions in the panel were focused on this. In Latin America, we have a lot of interventions, civilian interventions, arms control, related, for example, on the reduction of the arms availability, on the offer, associated with actions of civilian disarmament and restriction to carry weapons, but also on the reduction of the demand of firearms related with pedagogical campaigns of arms control and restriction to the access to weapons and regulations. So I am here showing this frame of diversion cases and entry points in Central America. Next, there are my information. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I think, again, you've done a remarkable job of mapping what is a real challenge for those working in the policy community, how to address, where are those leverage points, and what the particular possibilities might be. So I look forward to, in the question and answer period, delving into some of those issues further. But before then, I'm very pleased to introduce our final speaker of this afternoon, Maria Rodriguez Dominguez, who is a career diplomat from Mexico, who is currently working as Economic Affairs and Security Advisor at the Office of the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So Maria will brief us on the role and actions her government is taking to address the flow of firearms from the United States to Mexico. Welcome, Maria, and I turn the floor to you.
Good afternoon, Rachel. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this webinar. It is an honor to share this panel with such a distinguished group of experts. I would like to take this opportunity to talk about Mexico's global strategy to curb illicit arms trafficking. In my presentation, I will give you a glimpse of the social and economic consequences of illicit arms trafficking in Mexico. And I will also touch on the multilateral and bilateral strategies that Mexico is currently carrying out. As you can see in the next slide, insecurity and crime in Mexico cost the country 1.2% of its GDP. That's approximately $13.5 billion. Last year, 72% of the reported homicides were firearm related. I would also like to give you some facts on the social consequences gun violence has on women and girls. Estefania and Lucia already spoke about this in detail. For example, firearms were used in 7 out of 10 female homicides that were reported in the first half of 2020. And moreover, over the last 20 years, female firearm homicides grew 375%. These numbers are tragic and show the negative impact that gun violence is having on Mexico's human capital and economic productivity, and how detrimental this is for economic growth and social development. And they also show that curbing illicit arms trafficking is essential to reduce violence against women and girls. Next slide, please. I would now like to turn your attention to the multilateral strategies that Mexico has implemented to reduce illicit arms trafficking. CIFTA is a binding agreement among the countries of the Americas to control and regulate the illicit manufacturing and trafficking of firearms. It was adopted in 1998 and has been ratified by 31 countries. Only the US, Canada, and Jamaica have yet to ratify the agreement. Mexico has served as CIFTA's Secretary pro tempore since 2020 and has been working on advancing the recommendations to encourage these 3 countries to ratify the agreement, while also encouraging better accountability measures from state parties in terms of the level of national implementation. Mexico is also a party to the Arms Trade Treaty since 2014. And last year, Mexico joined the European Union ATT partner-to-partner program with the objective of implementing the provisions of the treaty. As part of the program's activities, we held 2 virtual workshops for Mexican government officials last February to promote a more comprehensive approach towards the registration and transfer of arms. We will hold more workshops and training sessions throughout the year to exchange good practices on preventing the diversion of arms and controlling international arms transfers. Additionally, curbing illicit arms trafficking is one of Mexico's priorities as a non-permanent member to the UN Security Council. In its upcoming presidency next November, Mexico will advocate for the need to address the dramatic consequences of illicit arms trafficking. Next slide, please. I'd now like to move on to the bilateral strategy that Mexico is currently implementing to stop the flow of illicit arms from the US. As my fellow panelists already mentioned, 70% of the weapons that arrive in Mexico come from the US. Recently, there seems to be a change of approach on the topic of gun violence with the arrival of the Biden administration. And Mexico stands ready to increase its cooperation on the matter through exchange of information and coordinated operations, among other measures. Last year, as part of our consular strategy, we created a database of arms monitoring in which 13 of the Mexican border consulates regularly report on the operations and seizures carried out in the border crossings. Having this type of information allows us to know what type of arms are being trafficked and where, and it also provides a better understanding of the trafficking problem at the border and helps to refine our strategies. We also have a soft power strategy implemented by our 50 consulates in the US to raise awareness of the impact of illegal arms trafficking in Mexico. Our intention is to create a conversation on the matter and position the issue on the US public agenda through outreach and engagement with local actors and leaders, participation in forums and webinars such as this one, as well as approaching legislators and officials to promote that they include the topic in their agendas. We think that the converging agendas of both governments can serve as an opportunity for serious action. And we also believe that renewed cooperation based on equal partnership and mutual goals is essential to protect the lives of Mexicans and Americans. Next slide, please. This leads me to my last point, which is related to the actions that we have taken to promote a cross-cutting approach in our strategies, to include a gender perspective and take into account the social and economic consequences of illicit arms trafficking. Along with our participation in international fora, we seek to put these commitments into practice. And for example, we have been in conversations with the UN Regional Center for Peace, Disarmament, and Development in Latin America to offer a training on firearms investigations with a gender perspective for Mexican officials, with the objective of tackling firearms-related crimes and strengthening institutional capacity. I also want to say that our strategy is also focused on promoting the availability of information in order to have more and better data and to exchange information with other agencies domestically and bilaterally that allows us to assess the impact of this phenomenon more in depth. That brings me to the end of my presentation, but I would just like to conclude by saying that our efforts highlight the importance of international cooperation in a global problem that doesn't only affect Mexico. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. I think the point that you just made at the end is really important, that it is not just up to one country or one community to solve these issues, but rather we need to work in partnership and identify strategies together that allow us to be forward-looking and pragmatic. I'd like to, for the next 10 minutes, invite the presenters on panel 2 to rejoin the conversation. So Catherine, Maria, Eugenio, and John. And we will have a small discussion amongst the five of us. And then at 4:30, I will, or 3:30 or 5:30, depending on where you are watching from, whatever time zone you're in. Sorry, looking at my own clock here as I've been keeping time. We will open to all of our panelists and to some of the additional questions that are coming through in the chat. I want to pick up on some of the common themes that you all raised about stopping the supply of weapons from the United States to Mexico. And there are legal and illegal channels that weapons flow through. There are individual actors as well as state actors that are involved in this transfer. I'm wondering if you could, and I'll just open it to all of you first and take volunteers, but is there a specific strategy when we look at the opportunities, as Maria just mentioned, of a new administration that is more open to these conversations and towards solutions? Is there something very pragmatic and specific that you can relate, or that you can point to? And I see John just put one in the chat, so maybe that's a good answer. Was anticipating my question. But perhaps, John, you could. I'm going to pick on you now and start with you. That's one particular strategy. We also heard about the assault rifle ban or assault weapons ban, and the impact that had on gun trafficking. So maybe, John, we'll start with you, and then I'll open to the others.
Well, I'll say something about what I put in the chat. I want to highlight something that Robert said in the discussion of the first half, which is that the politics of these changes are arguably much more difficult. We can create the public health analysis, but like in the county where I live, public health departments have maybe 2% of the budget that the sheriff's office has. And that reflects the politics that we're facing. So we can think about, quote, low-hanging fruit that, for example, that the executive branch can take, or that Mexico and the US administration could easily negotiate. So, for example, I think it's a fairly low-hanging fruit to change the way data about recovered guns is shared, which right now is governed by an MOU between the two countries, between the Fiscalía in Mexico and the Department of Justice in the United States, so that data can be used in other ways and analyzed, as Eugenio was talking about, to see, okay, where is this happening? How is it changing over time? What are how much of this is parts that are being then assembled in Mexico? How much of it is, there's many different things that need to be analyzed in order to intervene, whether we're talking about intervening in the production, in the retail side, in the trafficking side, wherever it is we want to intervene. And I guess I would say that I think that the bigger, higher hanging fruit, but probably much more important, is an assault weapons ban. And in part that is because so much of the violence in Mexico, whether it is actually committed with an assault weapon or not, is driven by fights for territory, fights to control commercial corridors. Some of those commercial corridors are for drugs or for people or for other kinds of contraband or goods or legal goods like oil. But the assault weapon as a more military style, with a more military capacity to control territory, becomes a more important piece. So I think the control of that particular kind of firearm is especially important.
Thanks, Eugenio. Let me turn to you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with John about the assault weapons and more data, but also you asked about strategy. And one thing that I thought was really interesting about what Robert said in the previous panel is about confronting some of the myths that this is a problem that it's impossible to tackle. And I would just want to start with the myth of the Second Amendment being like untouchable. If you go to the latest interpretation of the Second Amendment, it says that gun laws are possible. You can regulate who can possess a gun, what type of gun, etc. So I think start tackling these myths that this is a problem that cannot be addressed is definitely an important first step. Also, I think recognizing that the U.S. So we talk about, yes, U.S. is the biggest importer, U.S. interest, but the United States is composed of a lot of different actors as well, and there are a lot of allies in the United States that that definitely want to address gun trafficking as well. I mean, I think one strategy is exactly what we're doing here, connecting organizations from the United States with organizations from other countries to start talking about these issues and bringing them more and more into the political agenda. I do think that even slowly, the political landscape is slightly changing more towards being more open towards gun laws being passed in the US, and I think that's very important.
Thank you, and I think we can talk about the politics of these policies as well as sort of the utility of these policies, right? There's a very powerful gun lobby in the United States, which has made some of these common sense laws and approaches very difficult for Congress to pass, for the president, whoever the president is, to exert leadership on. And so that kind of strength and determination on these issues is quite important. I think political will to act, particularly in the United States, should not be underestimated. Maria, I saw that you had your hand up, and then Catherine, I'll turn to you as well.
Yes, I would like to touch on the assault weapons ban. I mean, it's worth noting that many of the assault and semi-automatic weapons that arrive in Mexico end up in the hands of drug cartels. And it's undeniable that this contributes to a level of firepower that puts Mexican law enforcement at a disadvantage. And, it has also been documented that the end of the 10-year assault weapons ban in 2004 resulted in an increase in gun-related deaths in both Mexico and the United States. And we are optimistic because we know that President Biden has a long-standing historical record of opposing gun violence. As a senator, he helped pass a 10-year assault weapons ban, and his presidential campaign platform included the prohibition of assault weapons, among other measures. And this is because of all these reasons, we would expect deeper conversations on the matter, and both in the US and bilaterally. And we also believe that, we're not specifically seeking that President Biden utilizes his executive authority to ban assault weapons, as we are very respectful of US domestic policy, but we would definitely welcome new legislation banning assault weapons. And we also believe that the recently introduced background check bill is a positive news, and all of these actions are a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I will give the last word to you before we invite our other colleagues to join us.
This is the last question of this panel. Okay, so
it's the last question specifically only for this panel, but there will be more questions for this panel and the other panel coming up. So you're not off the hook entirely.
Okay, no, I just want to take into advantage of the myths that Eugenio just referred. This is not related specifically on the topic of the flow from the Mexico to here, but I just don't want to take the opportunity to highlight that here in Latin America, we don't have a lot of documentation and analysis and research that really breaks the myths that can help to have an efficient arms control. I know Eugenio has developed a lot in the States, but for example, here in Latin America, we don't have a lot of references to really say that owning a gun makes you really safer, that the only thing that stops a bad guy is a good guy with a gun, and in the effectiveness of the interventions. So just to take into account, just to take this these myth words, I think this is one of the main topics we need to work in Central America and Latin America in general.
Thank you. And Eugenio asked for actually the last word on this one.
Yeah, no, I mean, you asked about strategies, and we are in the Consortium for Public Health Universities. So I actually did want to invite their role on this as well. The public health universities in Mexico, like Arturo has been doing, analyzing gun violence from the public health perspective, but also universities in the United States that have done really good job at analyzing the impact of gun laws within the United States, should open up that research and analyze the effect of gun laws in public health in other countries. And I know John loves this stat, and he's absolutely right about this. I'm criticizing a particular stat, actually, that mentions that 106 people die because of US guns every day. John is right in criticizing that that number is actually higher if we consider gun deaths in other countries as well. So that's just to say that I invite the public health universities to dig deeper into this US gun violence within the country, but also abroad.
Thank you, Eugenio. I want to, in our last 27 minutes together, to invite our panelists from the first panel to join this conversation and marry the issues of impact with solution. Because I think it is really important that we identify the challenges that we're faced with, but also that there are some really innovative opportunities to make a difference, that we, even in the absence of all the data that we would like, even with the absence of some political will, there are measures that we can adopt, implement to try to address these conversations. I want to also remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A function. You can write your question in Spanish or English. If I can't decipher all of the words in Spanish, I will make sure our interpreters help with that. So please feel free to put questions in Spanish as well. And I want to, as we're waiting for, I think, the last of our panelists to join us on video, to just say that I hope, I don't know if anyone from the Biden administration is listening, but I hope that there is courage, and I mean courage, to stand up to the forces that have not allowed us to have an honest, practical debate, exchange of ideas in this country, that the mythology that Eugenio referenced has been allowed to persist for decades, despite all evidence to the contrary. And it is time, it is enough. And I really do think we have an opportunity now to have a dialogue with our global partners, but also to take steps unilaterally to address these issues. I want to pick up on a topic that we concluded with the first session, which is what doesn't work. We know what doesn't work, and maybe, Robert, I could ask you to sort of summarize a little bit what you had put in the chat a little over an hour ago about what doesn't work, so that we can sort of turn to what might work and some of the approaches that many of you have mentioned.
Sure. What a rich conversation. And as somebody mentioned, terrific to see 83 people still on. But I mean, I think that the topic and the seriousness of it warrants sustained engagement. And I agree, Rachel, with your call for basta. You know, it seems like we've had this conversation, and you and I have been in this conversation for a long time. We are older than we look, maybe. But I can remember conversations about this 21 years ago, talking, and I think the good news is that there's been some evolution, and I think a lot more discussion, as we mentioned in the earlier conversation, about using data and evidence as the basis for smarter policymaking, bringing together public health and the criminology and the sociology and the technology fields in a more tight embrace. So I'm actually quite encouraged by some of the innovations, some of the successes across the region. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. I mean, Catherine sitting in Cali, Colombia experienced some of the most extraordinary declines in homicidal and gun-related violence on the planet over the last 20 years. I live in Rio, and in spite of all of the challenges and difficulties today, we saw 65, 70% drops in gun-related violence over periods of time as a result of concerted interventions. And similarly, in parts of Mexico, parts of Central America, the Northern Triangle, we've seen some dramatic reductions. So I think we have to counter this sort of, as was mentioned earlier, fatalism, the sense of inevitability, the sense that somehow there's something intrinsic about the region, and really start learning from our successes and diminishing our failures. So what doesn't work? Well, I think over and over and over again, and the evidence is fairly overwhelming, so-called mano dura, heavy fist, iron fist type strategies, and this has been emphasized by virtually every panelist, don't generate outcomes that, let's call it, not only don't generate the intended outcomes, they tend to generate counterproductive outcomes that actually set things back. And what do we mean by mano dura? Well, mano dura is one of those terms that gets thrown around all the time, but it tends to combine a combination of militarized or punitive policing together with extremely robust and aggressive criminal justice repression, together with a sort of a mass incarceration type strategies. It also tends to invoke the use of military type sort of strategies, as well as arming up communities as part of a self-defense response. So it's both rhetoric, it's laws, it's policies, it's programs, and they're immensely popular in parts of the region. So this goes back to this idea, and maybe it's appropriate that we're talking about it today, this sort of machiste, masculinized approach, which is pretty good for vote winning. So I think we've shown, and we've done cost benefits on this, that actually the costs vastly outweigh in treasure and blood the dividends in terms of violence reduction. Punitive policing, 3 strikes are out, heavy incarceration first strategies. Somebody mentioned the importance of avoiding pretrial detention, incarcerating nonviolent first-time offenders. All of these strategies across the Americas have generated nothing but, I would say, excessive expenditures and very little in the way of increased safety. Absence-led interventions, especially as it relates to drugs, very, very mixed outcomes in terms of positive returns, very little reductions in recidivism or repeat criminalization. Then we get into some things that are a little trickier. Community policing. Part of the thing about community policing, I'm actually an advocate of various types of policing with communities, but it tends to be applied in unspecific way, often not with a lot of fidelity. And so mixed returns in terms of community policing, as opposed to, say, problem-oriented policing or hotspot policing, which we can talk about later. School-based programs, a lot of emphasis on interventions focusing on at-risk children in schools and teens in particular, deviation programs, therapy-based programs, positive mentorship programs. Turns out these don't actually have a huge positive impact in parts of the region, partly because the people who are most at risk tend not to be in schools in the first place, but also it comes back down to the fidelity perhaps of interventions. Urban renewal and CIPTET, crime prevention with through environmental design programs, also have mixed impacts in terms of violence reduction. And then, interestingly enough, gun buybacks without deterrent effects don't really have positive outcomes. So we've been advocating for years and years and years the importance of amnesties and even toy gun buybacks, right? I mean, the idea of getting children somehow influencing attitudes towards guns as a toy, as well as real gun buybacks, don't tend to work because we tend not to get, as we know, the stuff that actually is potentially the most damaging, and it tends to fill in the demand. If the demand side isn't addressed simultaneously with supply, you tend to just have more guns coming into a situation. So they make us feel good. They're good copy. They make great press headlines, but actually from a public health perspective, they don't tend to work. So, I think just a final point here, there's been some pretty good meta reviews done over the years, really the last half decade, around looking at the array of interventions that have generated, let's really specifically here, violence reduction or violence prevention effects. And I think it's really important that we're diligent and focused on that, because we can get easily distracted about all the co-benefits. But the work by Thomas Apt and Chris Winship and others with USAID, the work by Vanderbilt, where they've looked at sort of dozens and dozens of interventions, have shown us a couple of things. One of which is that the research that's out there, still, notwithstanding the growth and evolution, is heavily biased towards the United States and Europe, and that we still need higher quality RCTs, like gold standard impact evaluation research in the region. That's starting to change. I mean, JPAL, the Campbell Cooperation, universities in the region, IDB, CAF, they're starting to invest in better and stronger and robust impact evaluations in the region. So I think we're going to fill that gap in the coming years. But I just want to emphasize that there is an emerging and credible evidence base, I think, around what does work, which we can talk later, Rachel, about, as well as explaining what doesn't. And I think I'll turn to that later.
Thank you. Arturo, before you jump in, I just want to pick up on this issue of masculinity, which you referenced, Robert, and which Estefania ended our first panel with. And I want to come back to that because I do think it leads to this conversation of what might be more successful. You outlined sort of these tried and true approaches that have been less than successful. So, Estefania, not to put you on the spot, but I just want to pick back up on the points you were making at the end of the first panel and bring in some of our second panel into that discussion. And just as a highlight, so you can start thinking about it, I'm going to turn next to issues related to international instruments and regional cooperation in this space. But first, let's narrow down a little bit and talk about the notion of combating masculinity or toxic masculinity, or whatever phrase you would like to use as a policy oriented solution.
I'm going to speak honestly. I don't have a thoroughly designed, proven intervention. I must say that not just regarding firearms, but generally men and masculinity tend to be left behind for very important political, historical reasons. Oh, and even in days like today, the focus is are women. But again, looking at data as to who generally buys guns, who generally uses guns, when you look at testimony of women that suffer domestic or intimate partner violence, the way guns are used to further the control of the man over the woman, you can sense this link here. And I know that other feminists and other scholars have sort of delved in more into the images of masculinity and how gun and violence get associated to being with a certain kind of man. And generally, just to say, for example, I think if you talk to a lot of feminists, there's a lot of, many are more convinced about masculinity, and generally it's, yes, we need to look into masculinity, but we also need to look at access to guns. Because I always say a macho with a gun and a macho without a gun, it's not the same thing. So the risk is different. But in here would be, it's not just about access, but tapping into those deeper shared understandings about what being a man and what being a man in control is, and how those notions might get amped up in contexts such as ours, where these ideas that Robert was talking about of how guns protect you sort of make sense, right? If everything out there is hostile, having a gun makes sense. So, and to me, this also would point to the importance of sort of like understanding that psyche as well. But I don't have anything further to say. If somebody has a tried and proven intervention, please let me know so we can further push for that.
I think, Catherine, you wanted to jump in on this point, and then John, and then Arturo, I'm coming back to you.
Yes, I really recognize that the gender perspective to arms control, I think, is one of the most prolific areas currently in the area of arms control. And not only because it's in vogue, like to put gender in all the topics, but also because it's a real opportunity. It's an effective opportunity of some areas that have been not considered properly in the general arms control. And this is, for example, in the campaigns of civilian disarmament. If we don't consider in the campaigns of civilian disarmament, these relationships of masculinity, of how people access the firearms, or how they use the firearms, we will not have complete campaigns. And also, for example, we have powerful tools, including gender perspective, for example, on the access of firearms. If we merge, for example, the policies of prevention of feminicide with arms control, we are going to be able to identify if there are people, men, that has been, that is in the records that maybe they had sexual violence or domestic violence and already has a gun. If you take the hands of these people, you could have effective ways to prevent violence. But also not only in the civilian side, there are other perspectives. For example, in all the international treaties, we have seen an increase of the participation of women in these discussions, in the plan of action and in all the discussions, allowing to introduce more of the perspectives of the risks of the women. And for example, this is included very importantly in the ATT, being the first treaty with a gender perspective in relationship to guns trade.
Thanks, Catherine. John, you had a two-finger on this as well.
Yeah, I want to build on what Catherine and Stephanie have said, because if we build interventions without reference to social movements, then we'll often find that they will not be implemented properly. And so I think we have an opportunity, and in many ways, what Catherine has just said is built upon the last 30 to 40 years of feminism and changes, social changes. And I want to say the same thing about the role of guns and white supremacy, right? There's an historical role in the United States that guns have in white supremacy. And right now, the same way that toxic masculinity is constructing the so-called need for a firearm in the home, white supremacy is also constructing the need for firearms both at the individual level and at the state level in order to push back on people of color and on movements of people in the global South and in specific communities. And we have an opportunity to connect this discussion of firearms with an anti-racist movement, particularly in the United States, but I think in other places as well, that can make the entire intervention more effective because there will be more integrated with a social movement.
I think that's a really important point, John, that these issues are far larger than just the movement of guns from one location to another location. And it's more than just how they are used or by whom they are used. It really is part, in many cases, of the social fabric that leads to all sorts of negative consequences. And so I think, again, we have an opportunity to think bigger than just the trafficking in these weapons and look at comprehensive solutions. Arturo, I wanted to make sure you had a chance to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted us to keep in mind the issue of accountability. As with other public health problems, for example, contamination of underwater drinking water supplies by certain industries, they merit the public nuisance suit because they harm, sometimes willfully, a lot of people. I think there is no doubt that the arms industry and the arms trade is conducting an action that is a public nuisance. So I would say we should keep in mind the legal avenue, litigation, class action lawsuits, both in US court or in international courts. I think we must also work together to bring the industry and make them accountable for the harm that they have done willfully and knowingly for decades. As John was saying, the weapons don't expire. And we believe from our research that there's more than 30 million weapons floating around waiting to be used. And this is too much damage not to bring those responsible and hold them accountable.
Thanks, Arturo. I think that I want to pick up on the point you just made about civil society and the role of various actors in this conversation, because it is never just been an issue that governments have had to solve alone. There's been a vibrant and robust civil society working on these issues for many years. You have many examples of that here, and many of us have worked together for decades, I dare to say, to try and address these issues. So there are partners willing to have these conversations. However, and I apologize, I keep getting on a soapbox here, but I think it's important to recognize that there must be the commitment by governments to take these issues on. There was a question in the Q&A about why the United States, why Canada haven't ratified CIFTA, which is yet another treaty, I would say, that the United States is absent from, even if, and I should point out, even if it abides by many of the provisions in that treaty, right? That it becomes a political statement not to sign on to a multilateral effort. So the question I guess I would have for all of you are, what are the opportunities for government to government cooperation? Is there an appetite for a regional summit on these issues? We have the Nuclear Security Summit. We have summits about, the COVID crisis. Is there an opportunity here to look at this from a regional perspective, perhaps outside of the Organization of American States or inside the Organization of American States, depending on, again, the politics of the situation, but to have this conversation? And what, if you all had sort of a magic pen, what would you write that agenda to be? Eugenio, I'm not sure if your hand is up for this one or from a previous question, but I'm going to call on you because I see a hand up.
Yeah, no, I do. I just want to highlight something from the previous question about guns and women that I know Stefania has highlighted, and Magda Kos as well, and that is to replicate some of the things that the United States has been done in terms of removing the guns immediately after, during the moment that the relation between men and women ends. The woman breaks up with the man for many reasons. Those are the dangerous situations. So replicating some of the things that have been implemented in the United States could be helpful. Coming back to your question, yes, I do think that the regional integration, and I have said this during numerous panels, that I think there should be a coalition with Mexico, Central America, Colombia, and Brazil that are big recipients of guns. There may be some challenges, political challenges with Brazil, but Mexico, Central America, and Colombia, in terms of forming this coalition, this summit to address the flow of US guns coming to their countries. But I think that push can also come from civil society organizations, or I guess will come from the push of civil society organizations coming together in events like this. I can mention that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has organized events that invite organizations from different countries to talk about this issue. So that's definitely another channel that can be exploited. I know Catherine has participated in one of those, and myself as well. So those, definitely the Organization of American States is also a good channel.
Anyone else want to jump in on this last question? Yes, Robert.
I'm going to be very brief because I'd like to hear others, but I simply, and I know you want to end in 4 minutes. So I mean, I think there's an abundance of treaties, conventions, protocols, agreements in the region in a region, by the way, that's notoriously fractious and mistrustful and struggles to find, I would say, meaningful forms of cooperation. I don't want to be unkind or ungenerous, but there are some challenges, certainly in my part, South America, and to some extent, I've seen this in Central America as well. And I've been to many of the offices that house these treaties and seek to implement them. And I know there's some challenges there. So confidence building is critical. Yes, more meetings, yes, more commitments, but I do think we have to get also better at enforcing them. And maybe that's where civil society comes in. And I like this point about moving that Arturo said from accountability towards, in a way, liability. And I think we're seeing a lot more action-oriented litigation happening in this space in ways that we hadn't in the past. And I think that's probably a promising development. When it comes to civil society, I think we have to get over this intolerable acquiescence with the status quo, this ability to coexist with murder, which is obscene in our part of the world. And so I think part of that is about civil society groups crossing the boundaries and uniting in their evidence and data-driven advocacy, being smart and sharp with their messaging. We tried this a couple of times, most recently with a campaign called Instinct for Life, which took the 7 countries with the largest homicide rates across the region: Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia. And there was a real push to set a hard target for a 50% reduction in homicide by 2030, which was absolutely consistent with SDG 16 and the broader 2030 development agenda. We got a lot of subnational engagement, cities, mayors, governors, not necessarily always the feds. Really, where the rubber hits the road, we saw some genuine engagement with evidence-based approaches, with checklists of what to do. So I do think that there's a real potential to ramp things up, certainly across civil society, and to create the kind of collective action that's required to really push not just governments, but citizens to a kind of a united realization that we cannot allow the current situation to continue. And I think getting over that apathy hill, getting that tipping point, whatever it is, 35% of the population agreeing. I mean, there's always these magical numbers about what constitutes tipping point, I think is critical, but it will require ramping up, I think, our civil society engagement and applying the pressure. I don't think we're going to get a lot of help from the outside. Let's be really honest here. Latin America is geopolitically in a part of the world, in a moment where the rest of the world is deeply concerned and preoccupied with their own concerns, in the wake of COVID. We're not going to see a lot of big pressure, I think, coming from the P5 or the Security Council or from the General Assembly or from, this has to be an effort led by Latin Americans within Latin America. And I do think we've got some good green shoots to grow on.
Thank you. And I do hate to cut this conversation off because I'm shocked that after 3 hours, we still have such a willing audience to engage on these issues. And it actually gives me great hope and enthusiasm for the work that we all need to do together to make some real policy change. But I am nothing if not a stickler to the time I am given. So I do want to make sure that we end on time, but I want to first thank the Consortium of Universities for Global Health for allowing us to have such a long and vibrant conversation. I want to thank our interpreters, who I know this is a long time to have to interpret complex ideas, and fast talkers and people from various countries with different accents. So I'm very appreciative to Elena and Ruth, and to Tiffany Frazier, who's behind the scenes and has made my job much easier for you all today, and having this so well organized, to everyone on the network, to our expert panelists who really such brilliance and thought-provoking interventions today. I'm incredibly appreciative, and to our attendees who stuck with us this entire afternoon. I'm really appreciative of all of the effort that you put into asking really interesting questions and pushing us to think more holistically. So with that, I want to bid you all a good evening, say gracias to all of you, buenas tardes, buenos dias, wherever you are in the world. Thank you. And we will see you again soon. Thanks so much.